That smile cost her nothing. That was the part she hadn't expected. How easy it was, after so many years of holding everything together, to simply let go. She set her teacup down without a sound, not a clink, not a scrape against the saucer. Beatrice Harlow had learned, somewhere in the 12 years of her marriage to Dr. Silas Harlow, that silence was a skill. You practiced it until it became second nature, until it stopped feeling like restraint and started feeling like armor. The morning of the dinner party, she had ironed the white tablecloth herself, because Mrs. Dunmore had taken ill, and no one else in the house pressed the corners the way Silas liked. She had arranged the flowers, late-season dahlias in burgundy and cream, and written out the place cards in her best penmanship, the kind her mother had drilled into her before she was 15. She had confirmed the menu with the cook, moved the decanter from the sideboard to the table, and back again, when she realized it blocked the sightline to the fireplace, and spent 40 minutes deciding between two nearly identical shades of candlelight to determine which made the dining room look warmer. None of this was unusual. None of it was even noticed. Beatrice was 22 when she married Silas Harlow. She had not been in love with him, and no one had pretended otherwise. Her father, a clergyman with more dignity than income, had been quietly relieved. Silas was 34, established, respected in 3 counties for his work in medicine, and possessed of a large house that needed a woman capable of running it. Beatrice was capable. Everyone agreed on that. It was in some ways the most consistent thing anyone had ever said about her. She had told herself, in those first months, that love might come later, that it grew from proximity and habit, the way ivy grew over stone, slowly, without drama, until one day you couldn't imagine the wall without it. She had been patient. She had been useful. She had learned the names of Silas's colleagues and their wives, what topics to raise and which to avoid, when to speak and when to pour more wine and say nothing at all. She had not been unhappy. That was the strange thing she would turn over in her mind later, in the small hours before morning, trying to understand how 12 years could pass without her recognizing them as lost. She hadn't been miserable. She had simply been invisible. Silas was not a cruel man. She would give him that, always. He had never raised his voice to her. He had never been unkind in any way she could point to directly. He simply, and this was the only word she had ever found that fit, did not see her. He spoke, past her at dinner. He made decisions about the house and their social calendar, and the disposition of her time without consulting her. Not from contempt, she had eventually concluded, but from the same thoughtlessness with which a man moves furniture, assuming it will stay where he puts it. She had tried, in the early years, to make herself more visible. She had offered opinions on his cases when he brought them home. She had suggested, once, that they might travel to Edinburgh in the spring, that she had always wanted to see the castle, that her cousin had written to say the wildflowers, that time of year, were extraordinary. Silas had looked at her over the top of his newspaper and said, "Edinburgh is cold even in May," and returned to reading. She had not brought up Edinburgh again. The dinner party was for 7 guests. 2 of Silas's colleagues from the County Medical Society, their wives, a visiting physician from London named Dr. Ashby, and a magistrate named Pruitt, whose wife had sent her regrets at the last moment, which meant the table was uneven, which Beatrice had already accounted for by quietly rearranging the seating, so no one would feel the asymmetry. The evening went well, as evenings always went when Beatrice managed them. The soup was hot. The conversation moved. She watched Silas at the head of the table, confident, entertaining, the version of himself he put on for company the way some men put on a good coat, and she felt something she could not immediately name. Not bitterness, not quite. Something quieter. Something that had been sitting in the corner of a room for years, and had finally, that evening, stood up and walked to the center. She had been speaking with Mrs. Ashby about a hospital in London that had recently begun training women as nurses, a subject Beatrice found genuinely interesting, when Silas's voice reached her from across the table. "And my secretary has been invaluable with the correspondence. Haven't you, Miss Harlow?" The table went quiet in the particular way a table goes quiet when something has just happened and no one is sure yet what it is. Beatrice looked at her husband. He was looking at her with the mild, expectant expression of a man who had just said something perfectly reasonable and was waiting for her to confirm it. Miss Harlow, not Mrs. Harlow, not Beatrice, Miss. His secretary's name was Miss Prudence Harlow, a coincidence of surname, nothing more. A young woman of 20 who had come to work for Silas 6 months ago, and about whom Beatrice had no particular feelings. But standing in her own dining room, in the house she managed, at the table she had set, Silas had looked directly at her and called her by that name. Not a mistress, not a rival, a secretary. He had mistaken his wife for his secretary. Later she would wonder if that was the worst part. Not the confusion itself, which she supposed could happen to anyone in a distracted moment, but the fact that it took him a full 3 seconds after the table went silent to understand what he had done. 3 seconds. She counted them. She was very good by then at counting things quietly. "Good Lord," Silas said when he got there. "I meant, Beatrice, of course, my wife. Forgive me. Long week." He laughed once, a short social laugh, the kind that invited others to laugh with him so the moment could dissolve. Several people did laugh, quietly, politely. Beatrice picked up her fork. She looked at the lamb on her plate, and something in her chest, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, simply released. She set the fork down again. She smiled. Not at Silas. She smiled at nothing in particular, the way a person smiles when they have understood something that has taken much too long to understand. "Please don't apologize," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "The lamb is excellent tonight. Mrs. Partridge has truly outdone herself." She turned back to Mrs. Ashby. She asked a question about the London hospital. The conversation resumed. The evening continued, but something had ended. What Silas did not know, what no one at that table knew, was that Beatrice Harlow had been preparing for 14 months. Not for this specific evening, because she could not have predicted this specific evening, but for the moment when she would finally accept what she had spent years resisting. That she was not going to become more visible in this house. That waiting for Silas to see her was like waiting for a man who had lost the faculty of sight to describe the color of the wall. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't even failure. It was simply the nature of what they were. She had started quietly and without announcing it to anyone, to save money. Small amounts, at first, adjustments to the household accounts that fell within her ordinary discretion. She had always managed the household finances, a fact Silas considered clerical rather than skilled. Over 14 months, she had set aside enough to live modestly for 2 years, if she was careful, which she knew how to be. She had written to her cousin in Edinburgh, not about the wildflowers, about lodging. She had asked, through a series of careful inquiries, that she spread across months, so they would not accumulate into a pattern. Whether a woman of education and some years of household management experience might find employment in the running of a boarding house, or a charitable institution. The answer, she had discovered, was yes. If the woman in question was willing to be practical about it and did not need anyone to be proud of her for it. She had done all of this without a single dramatic conversation, without an ultimatum, without so much as a raised voice or a slammed door. Because Beatrice had spent 12 years learning that the most effective thing she did in this house, she did quietly. The guests left at 10:30. Silas was in good spirits. The evening had gone well. The magistrate had laughed at his stories. Dr. Ashby had expressed interest in a collaboration. He poured himself a brandy in the study and left the door open in the way that meant he might want company, but would not ask for it. Beatrice went upstairs. She did not rush. She had packed the essential things 2 weeks ago, wrapped in brown paper and stored in a trunk she had addressed to her cousin's house. Under the guise of sending winter things ahead of a visit she had told Silas she was considering. The trunk was already gone, collected by a carrier on Thursday while Silas was at the surgery. What she packed tonight was only what she needed for the journey. A small bag. Practical. She had been practical her entire life. There was no reason to stop now. She wrote the letter at the writing desk in her room, on the stationery she always used, in handwriting that was entirely steady. Silas, I have gone to Edinburgh, where I intend to remain. I am not leaving in anger, and I hope you will not receive this in anger. I am leaving because I have understood, slowly, and with some difficulty, that we have been 2 people living in the same house without actually living together, and that this arrangement has cost us both more than either of us has named. You will need someone to manage the household. Mrs. Partridge knows where everything is. She is more capable than you have given her credit for. I wish you well genuinely. Beatrice, she did not sign it, Miss Harlow. She almost did. For a moment she sat with the pen over the page and considered it. The precision of it, the way it would articulate in 5 letters everything she could not say in 12 years. But she decided against it. That kind of pointed gesture was, for people who needed Silas to understand. She no longer needed that. She sealed the envelope and left it on his desk, propped against the pen stand where he would see it when he sat down in the morning. She was out of the house before the hall clock struck midnight. The street was quiet. It was October, and the air had that particular edge to it. Not cold enough yet to be winter, but cold enough to be honest about what was coming. Her bag was not heavy. She had, over many years, become very good at carrying only what was necessary. The early train left at 5:30. She had several hours. She walked to the inn, at the far end of Market Street. She had stayed there once, years ago, when the house was being repaired after a burst pipe, and the woman who ran it had been kind without making a production of it. Beatrice had remembered that. She took a room and sat in the chair by the window and did not sleep. She was not distressed, exactly. She was something else. Something she turned over carefully, the way you turn over an unfamiliar coin to read what it says. After a while, she decided the word was present. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily account for, entirely present in her own life. She thought about the dinner party. About the moment Silas had said Miss Harlowe and looked straight at her. She had heard, in that moment, the whole shape of the last 12 years. Not as an accusation, not even as a story about failure, but as a simple fact, the way the fact of a season is simply a fact. It had been what it was. She had been who she was inside of it, and now she was choosing to be somewhere else. She was not angry at Silas. That surprised her, sitting in the chair in the small room above Market Street, with the clock ticking on the mantel. She had expected, somewhere in the long rehearsal of this departure, to feel anger at some point. The clean, clarifying kind that would make the choice feel justified. But it wasn't anger she felt. It was something closer to grief, and beneath the grief, something lighter. Like a room with all the windows opened. Silas found the letter the following morning. He read it standing at his desk, in his dressing gown, with his coffee going cold on the corner of the blotter. He read it twice, because the first time he read it he was looking for something that wasn't there. A hint of melodrama, a list of grievances. The architecture of a crisis he could reap into in the way he responded to crises, which was directly and efficiently, and by identifying the problem and correcting it. There was no list of grievances, there was no crisis exactly. There was only a statement of fact, written in Beatrice's very steady hand, and a piece of information he had not known. That his wife had been intending to leave, had prepared to leave, had spent over a year becoming the kind of person who could leave, and he had not noticed any of it. He sat down. He tried to remember the last time he had looked at Beatrice, not in the direction of her, not past her, at the room she had arranged, but at her, and found that he could not identify a specific occasion. He could picture her at the table, at the doorway, moving through the house with the efficient quiet that had always struck him as one of her better qualities, though he realized now, sitting with her letter in his hands, that he had never once told her that. He had called her Miss Harlowe. He had called his wife by his secretary's name, in their own dining room, in front of 7 people, and had laughed about it, and she had smiled. He remembered that smile now, in a way he hadn't at the time, because at the time he'd been relieved the moment had passed. And she had asked about the lamb. The lamb. She had redirected the entire table's attention to the lamb. He thought about that for a long time. He sent a telegram to his colleague Forsyth, canceling the morning appointments. He sat in the study for 3 hours with the letter and his cold coffee and a growing, uncomfortable sensation that he was not used to feeling, which was that he was the problem in a situation he had always assumed was simply the situation. He did not go to Edinburgh. Not immediately. He was not sure, yet, that he had the right to, but he wrote to her. It took him 4 drafts over as many days, because the first 3 were not honest. They were efficient, they identified the problem, they proposed corrections, and he was beginning to understand that efficiency was not what the moment required. The 4th letter said, Beatrice, I read your letter and understood, for the first time, that I had made you invisible without ever choosing to. I don't know if that is better or worse than choosing it. I have been trying to determine what I should say to you, and I find I don't have a corrective. I only have the wish to have seen you more clearly, and the acknowledgement that I didn't, and the question, which I recognize you are not obligated to answer, of whether it is too late to try. He signed it Silas. Not Dr. Harlowe. Not your husband, just Silas. Beatrice received the letter on a Tuesday morning in the small apartment she had taken near the boarding house, where she now worked, keeping the accounts and managing the schedule of a house that took in 8 women. Teachers, mostly, and 1 young widow, who needed a clean room and a hot breakfast, and a landlady who minded her own business unless she was needed. She read it at the kitchen table, with her own tea, in her own chair, in her own time. She read it twice. She was, it turned out, also someone who read difficult things twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the Edinburgh street below, at the October light and the people moving past. And she thought about the 4 drafts she was certain it had taken him to write it. She thought about the version of Silas who had laughed at his own mistake and waited for the table to move on. And she thought about the version who had finally, apparently, sat still long enough to be uncomfortable. She picked up her pen. She did not write "Come to Edinburgh." She was not ready for that. She was not sure, yet, what she was ready for. She was 34 years old, and she had spent the first 12 years of her adult life managing someone else's house so well that she had become indistinguishable from the house itself. She was not going to rush the next part. She wrote, "Silas, thank you for the fourth draft. I know it was the fourth. I have written enough letters in my life to recognize when someone has worked to get there. I am well. I am, in fact, more well than I have been in some time, which I tell you not as a wound but as a fact, because you asked for honesty, and I find I am willing to offer it. I will not ask you to come here. I will not say don't. What I will say is this. I am not finished. I have not disappeared. I have simply become more visible. To myself, first, which should perhaps have come sooner. Whether there is a version of our life that begins again from that, I genuinely don't know. But I am still here, and I am still Beatrice, and for the first time in 12 years, those two things feel like the same statement." She sealed it. She addressed it to the house on Fenwick Street. His house, not their house, though perhaps that distinction, too, was something that could be revisited, eventually, if they were both willing to be honest about what a house was for. She posted it on her way to the boarding house. The morning was bright and cold and clear, and the cobblestones were still damp from the night's rain. And Beatrice Harlow walked down the middle of the street, her bag on her arm, her head up, her pace entirely her own. She was not gone. She was for the first time somewhere.